How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I've got a very special guest for you all. He was actually one of the very first guests I had on Strength Chat, so awesome to welcome him back. Today, I'm joined by the man, the myth, the legend, the man behind Calgary Barbell, the one and only Bryce Krawczyk. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on again.
No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. I
hmm
know it's been a while since we last spoke, and obviously been following the content that you've been putting out there. But how are you? What's been happening in your world recently? What's been going on?
Um, I'm good. I've been kind of battling some some more injury stuff, slightly different injury stuff. I had some knee issues over the last like year or so that have been kind of derailing things and making things a bit inconsistent and sometimes painful. But I think like kind of that's just the way it goes maybe at some point for some people. So been working around that and things to be seem to be pretty well on track at this point. I'm looking at doing another competition in August here. So yeah, training seems to be on track with that, and things with Calgary Barbell are picking back up. We kind of had a lull in a lot of our sort of content and social media stuff while we figured out HQ and how to do all the stuff we wanted to do. But that as well seems to be, a bit more back on track now. So things are good. Things are
Ah,
good.
nice.
How about
Well,
for
no,
you?
obviously with the content that you've been putting out there, I had some overall topics that I had in mind to chat about, but I saw a post that you put up a couple of days ago about the obviously within powerlifters, people are going to pick up injuries. You mentioned there about your own injuries and everything, but the three R's. That you
hmm
found quite helpful for anyone who didn't see that, because I looked at that and I thought, do you know what? I thought that was really helpful for myself. So I had a little bit of a niggle in my foot. So basically squatting and deadlifting, just yeah. I remember I was actually sat down. I was actually sat downstairs and I needed to go to the kitchen, and I was like, I just generally don't want to get up because my foot's my foot's hurting. But do you just want to give a little bit of context around what that post was and what that meant?
Sure. So I honestly I wish I could remember better where I got them from. I'm not sure if it was from a session with my sports psychologist or if I had picked them up in school at some point or from a sports psychology textbook or whatever. But essentially the three R's are to react, relax, and refocus. So, when you run into some kind of roadblock, be it an injury or a plateau or anything like that that just is it triggers those kinds of like frustration and anger and all that kind of stuff. Essentially you go through the three R's, and the first thing you do is react and kind of feel your feels, be in your feels if you need to, and let yourself be frustrated because it's frustrating. Like you can't deny that those kinds of things are gonna piss you off and make you feel stuck and make you feel angry. So, acknowledge those and feel those. And then the second R, relax, is basically just to try to let that go after you've kind of felt it to what you feel is an acceptable amount. But to try to like kind of breathe it out and let it go and just try to calm yourself back down and get back to a place where you can kind of think straight, because sometimes that's a bit of a challenge. And then lastly is refocus. You try to look at, okay, can we identify any reason that we ended up here that we can try to avoid next time? What is the next step? Where do you go from here? How do you progress, and how do you get back on track with where you're, trying to get to, wherever that might be? Because I think the concept of the three R's, I think, applies pretty well to a lot of stuff, well beyond lifting and beyond just the gym or progress and stuff like that. I think you can use a process like this pretty well in a lot of different aspects of life. I think anytime you're getting waylaid by setbacks or anything like that. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's kind
definitely.
of the concept.
Yeah, and I thought that was pretty good because there was I've spoken with clients and members of the gym, and like what you say, sometimes it's just a case of something crap happened at work, so then you react and you go and have a beer or whatever it may be, if you're talking about food or anything like that. And sometimes there's there's things that get put out there of, like what we touched on there, the 3 R's, but then sometimes, well, from your own experience, did all three of them kind of get nailed, or was it a case of trying to work through each of them? Because there's sometimes methods to be used out there, but
Mhm.
not everyone might not get them all at the same time. It takes a little bit of time to maybe process them. How did you find that in terms of injuries that you've had, or through your own lifting and life, if you like?
Mhm. I mean, I think it comes down to like each individual setback, right? So like take my knee, for example, if I have a bad day, I kind of have to go through all three of the R's to try to figure out like, okay, what are we doing next? Like let myself be pissed off that whatever, it limited me that day, or it feels like right now I'm not making as much progress as I'd like to with, alleviating or lessening the symptoms and stuff. But I think, yeah, I think it's more of like a practiced skill to be able to kind of more quickly and more efficiently go through that process of getting the crap out, getting sort of recentered, and then getting back on track. And I think the more that you can kind of practice going through all of those steps, the easier and more natural it's going to be. It's like any other, kind of skill. I think the hardest part is probably the relax part. The react part's pretty easy usually.
Yeah, yeah. I can vouch for that. With that as well, from a coach's point of view, and I know there's sometimes you can talk about patience in training, and things take time.
Mhm.
How has that kind of impacted your approach in terms of coaching, but then also impacting your own training in terms of developing that skill, if you like?
You mean like the aspect or the like the concept of patience?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of been forced into a place where I have to kind of embody that. And it's a combination of the fact that I've been doing this for a very long time, and progress and PRs and stuff in my own lifting are hard to come by. They're few and far between at this point, and it's almost more about like putting together the individual pieces because I've had a recent meet where I PR'd my squat, and I had a good deadlift, a couple meets ago, and most recently my bench was really good at my most recent national competition. So it's like I'm just trying to take each of those little bits and put them together into one really good meet. Um, but because of the sort of nature of things, I think it's a matter of like acceptance almost as much as it is patience. It's just kind of understanding that the process is the process, and that there's only so much agency we have on it. Like you can beat your head against the wall and train yourself into oblivion, and do all of the food and recovery and blah blah blah, but it's like your body's only going to adapt as fast as your body can, and that's determined by a whole lot of different stuff that unfortunately we have zero control over. So some people are pretty sort of predisposed to doing really well at this, and even still those people are gonna get to, and a lot of them have gotten to points where things slow down. So if you don't, if you can't accept that, and you can't kind of come to terms with that and embody some kind of patience in your training, then you're going to have a hard time. I think that's why and where a lot of lifters kind of get caught up and maybe burnt out and maybe walk away from the sport is, as soon as they're faced with their first sort of serious setback or string of setbacks, it just becomes not worth it. And I'm not trying to shame people who end up feeling that way. I think that's very normal and natural. And a lot of my friends, like very, very close personal friends I met through lifting, don't compete anymore because it's just not worth it to like deal with all of the things that come along with it to try to push for performance.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, there's that aspect of it. And as well, in my coaching practice, yeah, that's something I try to, impart impart to my athletes pretty regularly, is that kind of acceptance. It's like, let me worry about reformulating and combing through the data and trying to figure out what's working and what's not, and you know tweaking and doing all this kind of stuff. And, you know, for you, the best thing you can do is just kind of buy into the process. And I also try to take a really collaborative approach with a lot of my lifters, and you know, get their feelings and their intuitions involved very much in the coaching process and programming. So I think that helps too, right? Because when it comes to sort of accepting the length of a process that, you know, takes as long as getting good at powerlifting, I think it's easier to kind of accept that if you feel like you have some agency in it, if you feel like you can actually make an impact on it. And I mean, that was one of the things that got me into powerlifting in the first place, was like, if I want to be better, I just, you know, train hard and I see those results. At least at first you saw that, you know, you see things like pretty quick, you know, 6 months in, you're like, oh, I look different. I've put 20 kilos on my lifts, and, you know, all that kind of stuff is moving pretty quick, and it's rewarding. But
do you think, because one thing you touched on there in terms of you know, burnout or not maybe enjoying the process anymore, do you think that's a combination of sometimes people's bodies just thinking, you know, if it actually it's not feeling good anymore, because obviously, even though to do powerlifting, you've also then got to, like, I think sometimes people can forget that actually it is like a hobby, if you like. It's not, you know, not professionals. It's not like rugby or football or anything like that. And or do you think it's more of a mindset, a mindset side of thing that can sometimes feel as though, do you know what, actually I'm not invested in this anymore. And then also a second question from that would be, do you think sometimes actually taking a step away from powerlifting and just, you know, taking time to get back into it, maybe enjoying training a little bit more is a good approach? I know there was kind of like I fired two things at you there, but
no, that's all good.
Sense? Yeah.
I think firstly, it's really hard to separate the sort of like mental from the physical, right? Because they're so intertwined and so like codependent, right? If the body feels good and you're healthy and things are moving well, I mean, you're going to have more motivation. You're going to be more excited. You're going to feel more optimistic about your progress and your sort of prospects within your training. And then, you know, the opposite is also very true, where if you feel like crap and your body feels like it's, you know, hanging on by a thread, you're going to be a little more tentative. You're going to be a little more demotivated, or, you know, a little more pessimistic about your training outcomes. So I think the reason that people end up kind of walking away or burning out is just that it doesn't make sense to like do all of this and feel like that and go through the, you know, the peaks and very maybe big and very long and treacherous valleys between those peaks. You know, if those peaks stop being so attractive or stop seeming as attainable, you know, my friends who have kind of stepped away from competitive lifting, I think all of them, I would say all of them still lift in some capacity, right? It's still very much a part of their lives and a part of their routine and something they really enjoy, but it's not, you know, all about hitting new PRs, and it's not all about getting to the next competition. And, you know, I've heard some of them express interest in, oh, maybe, you know, maybe I'll do another competition one of these days. But I think, to now get into the sort of second part of the question, I think the reason that they're in that headspace to feel good about lifting and to feel good about the potential of competing again is because they were, you know, they saw that it wasn't working. You know what I mean? They saw that it wasn't worth it for them at that point to keep, you know, beating their head against the wall, trying to be, you know, at the top end of what their body's physically capable of. And sometimes it's really hard to just scale that down and be like, oh, okay, well, I'll just go to like lifting casually. If you've spent like 4 years chasing the bleeding edge of performance of whatever you're capable of, it's tough to just be like, oh, I'll just take 10 or 20% off of that. You know what I mean? So I think in a lot of cases, yes, it is a maybe necessary for people to completely walk away, you know, go find some other stuff, focus on some other things, lose or gain some weight that they weren't because of powerlifting, you know, just get to a place where they're feeling healthy. And then, in a lot of cases and a lot of times, I think people will reconnect with lifting and sort of find another way to fit it into their life. But a lot of the times they have to kind of reformulate things without lifting present to be able to do that.
Yeah,
But
definitely. And one thing, just kind of building on as you were chatting there, because I think sometimes with that, I think it can be quite hard. I know for myself, I think my last competition was maybe a year and a bit ago.
mhm,
And literally, as you were saying, I was like, that's kind of what I did, wanting to drop a little bit of weight. Maybe a couple of the people that I trained with moved away, so I was
mhm,
training by myself, not really enjoying it a little bit. And sometimes it can be quite hard because once you've been to a competition, you kind of have that competition high and think,
mhm.
oh wow, this is amazing. When's the next competition that we have? And during that process of training, which we touched on, it's kind of sometimes it's problem solving and thinking a little bit like what you mentioned. We've got a good squat, a good deadlift in a different meet, and trying to combine that together. I think as powerlifters as a whole, it is problem solving. How can we get my technique on my bench to make sure that it's getting stronger? And do you think that's why, because maybe for the majority of powerlifters, we are maybe problem solvers and trying to think about how can we get better, how we get stronger, that when we're faced with these obstacles, challenges, frustrations, that we maybe spend too long trying to overcome them rather than thinking, no, actually this is going to be the best course of action, rather than trying to keep move forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason that so many, people on very opposite ends of that kind of very creative versus very logical thinking spectrum end up in powerlifting. And I think people on both extremes, like myself, very much on the creative side, you got people like Mike T, and Israel and that kind of stuff, who are very much like computer brains basically, and just like have a very very logical way of sort of like breaking down and compartmentalizing data and thinking about things in that sense. And I think both of those approaches work really well, especially if you can get some of the other, into whichever one you tend towards. Um, but yeah, I mean the whole of powerlifting is definitely creative problem solving, and that's one of the biggest things that I get out of it, and why I find it so stimulating, and why it's been, the only career I've been able to do for this long. I've been coaching powerlifting now for 9, 10 years, something like that. And before that, I probably had 9 or 10 different jobs in, half this amount of time. So I think, yeah, for me, it's definitely a fun way of kind of exercising my brain to work with people and to, play off how much do we weight the lifter's intuition versus what I see in the data versus what I have, maybe a bias for, or what I've seen in my own training, and trying to apply different weights and different values to all of the different kind of data sources, to make the best decisions. And how long can we run similar protocols for when they're working really well before it stops working, and trying to find different ways to think outside of the box because of the needs of different strategies for individualization when it comes to different lifters, and so on and so on. Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, part of what drew me to it for sure. And I think that the people that are better at that and better at changing pace and kind of finding ways around the adversities and finding ways around the restrictions and around the plateaus and that kind of stuff, those are the people that I think tend to be able to stick with things more so than those who feel the need or kind of have a hard time rather, with just wanting to go through things. And I think that plays very heavily into my kind of philosophy, and my journey through injuries and stuff has been trying to find ways around instead of through.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's that thing of I can't remember what the analogy is, but it's kind of yeah, you don't always have to knock things down. Sometimes just actually building a door is going to be a lot more
Mm-hmm.
a lot kinder on you,
Yeah.
on your body. With that as well, with the kind of finding the solutions to things, and finding things away from it. What's kind of like the biggest uh lessons that you've learned, or kind of because I always think when anything happens with an injury or from competitions or anything like that, you can always add something into your toolkit. Is there
Mhm.
anything that maybe not surprised you, but being thought, oh, actually, I've not thought about doing it this way in terms of like the lessons you've learned, either from a lifter or from people that you've worked with.
I think maybe one of the biggest things that I've kind of seen a trend for in a lot of lifters, including myself, is that I think once you've kind of aged into a certain training age and you've spent enough time, doing these movements and have a pretty damn good sort of neural base for this kind of thing, I think that your ability to kind of come back from a prolonged or extended time pretty far from, what you would consider, competition specific powerlifting training, the ability to kind of bridge that back into, more sport specific strength, I think becomes you become a lot better at it. You're able to do it a lot quicker with a lot less work. Um, and I've seen that in my own training a number of times coming into meets, not really sure how things are going to go. I only had 3 or 4 weeks of real training and, all that kind of stuff. And then being able to get there on meet day and be like, oh, yeah, it's kind of like riding a bike. And put up, weights that were way beyond anything I was able to touch in training and that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of an interesting insight, and I've had a lot of conversations with Mike about that to that extent as well. And also just yeah, I mean, I guess finding different ways to kind of identify and work around my own biases, because I tend to, I see something working or I feel something working in my own training, and to me that's a really big, piece of evidence. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
well, I've felt this firsthand. So trying to identify when, okay, like I'm starting to pull down a lot of my clients' intensities a little too much because for whatever reason, like the lower intensity ranges or maybe a little less volume has been working really well for me. And I've tried it with a few clients and it worked really well as well. So now I'm trying to apply it to, maybe situations where it doesn't necessarily fit. So I think trying to find like where the boundaries of those sort of biases or preferences come into play, and then trying to ensure that you still have the ability to stomp all over those for the clients that need something very different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about a few of my clients that train, 5 or 6 days a week with just so many sets and so many reps and high intensities, like stuff that I just could not survive anymore. But
Yeah.
that's what these lifters need. So I can't be programming for them because of what works for me. I have to be able to, really throw that aside and just think about the context of that lifter.
Yeah. Does that vary in terms of the because you touched on there sort of the training age of the client, of the athlete, how long they've been doing it for, and I think sometimes, and I've fallen into this trap. Oh, so it works for me. Is it going to work for somebody else? And then all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
that one subject turns into, oh well, I've tried it with 4 people and go from there. Does that kind of knowing when to apply that um change on the level or the experience of the client that you're training, or what's kind of the process of finding out whether, okay, so I'm going to give this a go? Because if it's a beginner, you kind of anything that you give them is going to work,
Mm-hmm.
whereas obviously as they've progressed, it's kind of maybe refining it a little bit. What's kind of been your approach with that to find out what works?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that definitely the training age being higher would generally seems to necessitate a lot more individualization, right? If people have been training for a year, well, I mean, you could probably kind of just throw some pretty generic stuff there and it's going to work. And maybe find some really good tendencies towards certain rep ranges or intensities and stuff. And you start to build kind of a plan for individualizing things. But certainly when you get to lifters who have 8 or 9 or 10 years in the sport, it seems like there's a pretty specific, or there's going to be a pretty specific way that training works for them. And it might not be like anything I've seen before. I think in a lot of cases, starting with my own experience, has allowed me to do a really good job of coaching and programming, because I've tried and done and put myself through so many of these different protocols and approaches and high volume and low volume and high intensity and low specificity and blah 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 blah. Because I've done all those things, I think it's really cemented those kind of different strategies as really reachable tools. It's just very easy for me to be like, oh yeah, like I can pull X, Y, or Z thing out of the toolbox because I did that for 2 years. So I don't mean to like decry the value of having done something yourself, seeing it work, and then applying it to the way that you're programming and coaching for clients, because I think that's how a lot of coaches operate, or most coaches operate even. But yeah, it definitely does become a thing of like, okay, am I applying this too broadly? Am I starting to assume this is working instead of actually checking myself as to whether it is or isn't working? So,
And for the coaches listening, do you think that's a useful tool for them to develop their armory or their toolbox to actually in their own training try these things? Because I know sometimes you can kind of, like what you mentioned, you can kind of get attached to one way and think, well, everyone will be able to do that, as opposed to actually trying them out yourself. Because throughout everything, I know from the very first competition that I did when I first started training, you kind of get an understanding of, I'm not going to be able to do that in terms of maybe one time. Obviously a bit older than a lot older than when I first started competing. So other things work. Do you think that's a useful tool for coaches to learn and develop their own experience, if you like, to be
oh
a
yeah,
source of information?
yeah. I mean, for sure it is. I think some of I would say the largest resource that I have as a coach is drawing on my own experience. That's where I've been able to find a lot of things, and a lot of it comes down to the coaches that I've been coached by, right? I worked with a local coach here for a while. I worked with Brian Carroll for a while. I worked with Mike T now for a number of years, and I constantly learn things because he's thrown them at me and I've done them, and then I kind of think about it and I pick it apart and I think about why it might have worked or why it didn't, or how I can apply it or how I might change it if I apply it, or how I think I might be able to do this better, and those kinds of things to try to enhance my own coaching process. And I think if you're an athlete who's also coaching and you're not thinking of that, like, you're really shooting yourself in the foot. Like, you should be looking at your own training absolutely as a means of gathering data and putting more tools in your toolbox. And also, yeah, I mean, if you see something cool on the internet and everybody's blowing up about I know there's a big thing with Mike started implementing really long eccentric tempos, like the 600 tempo stuff, and he had I think a number of high profile lifters, including myself, and he kind of I think it was a Cal Dietz thing, maybe, that he had kind of like been inspired by and wanted to try it out. So he threw it at a bunch of his high level lifters, and the next thing you know, everybody's like, ooh, like, this is the new hotness, everybody's doing it. And I think, yeah, sometimes if you see stuff like that on the internet and you're like, oh, I wonder why everybody's doing this, like, try it out. Especially if you're programming for yourself. I mean, obviously you have to take into consideration, if you're a high level lifter and a coach, then it's a little trickier to just experiment and mess around with your training just for the sake of it. But even then, if you're able to find some protocols that seem to work or seem to hit really well with you, like, absolutely, those should go in the toolbox.
Yeah. Not 4 weeks out from a competition, just throwing an absolute curveball and be like, right, let's give this.
I mean, it depends how brave you are and how good training's going or how poorly training's going. Maybe you do want to throw a curveball at it, see if something can change drastically.
Yeah,
But,
with that as well, because it's kind of I'm kind of in agreement with you. I'd always want to give it a go and then just find out for myself, because for some people it might actually work. But do you think that too often coaches and lifters can just take people's words for it? Because there are trends. There's always going to be trends and a new way of doing something. Whereas ultimately, the more that you've trained for, like what you mentioned, you get an understanding of what's going to work, what's going to actually feel good. And do you think sometimes people could just jump on trends for the sake of it because well, they're doing that, so that must work, rather than looking at the population that they're working with?
Yeah, I mean, I think any tool needs to be vetted, and it needs to be vetted on like an individual level. It's not you can't really apply like a rote rule of like this works, this doesn't work, because it just isn't that simple. You have to think about, does this work for lifter A? Does this work for lifter B? So, I mean, the tools are all well and good to have, but if you're not checking them and you're not open to being wrong about things and you're not looking for holes in your systems and in the way that you're implementing things, then I mean, you're gonna miss a lot, and you're probably gonna, not be as effective at what you're trying to do for lifters.
And with that as well, because obviously we've spoken about trying to add things in and change things and try things out as you progress as a powerlifter. You kind of maybe settle into a weight class. Sometimes, yes, you can go up and down, but as you progress, you kind of, as you get older, you kind of like maybe level out a little bit, unless you want to go up a weight class, or even drop down. In terms of adding things in terms of hypertrophy, in terms of muscle mass, do you think it's harder as you progress through in powerlifting to try and add those other elements in, rather than trying to have maybe a bigger focus or a better balance of that when you first start powerlifting or strength training?
It's a good question. I think, I think again, it probably varies lifter to lifter. But I do think that, and I guess I'll just kind of draw on my own personal experience, because there's going to be so much variation in that, right? Like I have lifters who just explode when they first start training, and it's just super easy for them to pack on a bunch of muscle, and they're able to go up 2 weight classes in a couple of years, and they got a pretty good body composition there, and things are great. And then you can look at a kind of a case study like mine, where I've essentially been gaining weight since 2012. And, like I cut for my first meet and I competed at 83, and it took me a number of years to fill out the 105s, because it's pretty easy to get into the 93s. Excuse me. But, and then again, I've been filling out the 120s now for 6 years. So, I mean, for me, it's just been a thing of like constant incremental growth, right? Like just trying to gain at a very, very slow rate. I mean, there's also some inconsistencies in my nutrition and my ability to be able to actually push training and a lot of that kind of stuff that have made things a little bumpier than maybe they could have been. But yeah, for me, just going really, really slow in terms of the hypertrophy, in terms of, seeing myself as a 120 and being able to say like, okay, yeah, I don't need to be like a full 123 kilos, cutting 3 kilos of water weight. My first meet is a 120. So just, I think, I don't know, I guess if I had any kind of like wisdom on the topic, it would be to just like be okay competing as a light, whatever, if you're trying to go up, or a light, whatever, if you're trying to go down, you know what I mean? If you're trying to go from 83 to 74, and you do a few meets at like 78, I don't know, maybe that's better than just like destroying your training to cut 10 kilos in 10 weeks or something.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I think the key thing that you said there is just like trying to destroy yourself, trying to get to one point or the other. How much have you found it being? Because obviously the time frames on that, like it's not, that's a long period of time to build up from there. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen straight away. What's been the uh, has it been the nutrition side of things that you've had to develop on from there, or has it been, because obviously you can talk about like what you mentioned about the client, about clients that you've worked with, you can add in a little bit of training, and all of a sudden they're packing muscle on, and it takes a little bit longer. Is the biggest impact, that nutrition to get up to that point? The only reason I ask is, I know when I went up to the 120s, I went up relatively quickly, But that wasn't all muscle when I when I went up to 120s. It was a case of no, I'll just eat. That makes sense. Then all of a sudden you
Mhm.
realize, well, I'm knackered after sessions. Like there's no way I'm going to be able to lift this. You know, I'm lying down for 10 minutes between sets. Is that the biggest thing that you found for like a long run up to increasing a weight class?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously if you if you're eating a surplus, you'll go up. But I think I don't know, I might be going out on a bit of a limb here, but I think that a lot of the additional sort of non-specific bodybuilding style stuff is probably less useful for someone who's pretty experienced. I think that for a novice lifter who's, maybe 1 to 3 or 5 years, again, like you break down the definition of novice and blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah. But, for somebody who's a little earlier in their powerlifting career, I think it's probably more beneficial to be doing like some bicep curls and some lateral delt raises and, all that kind of stuff. But I think for somebody, who's pretty down the road a bit, I mean, I think doing the main lifts, there's probably some ways you can get some good hypertrophy stimulus in. I think basically any powerlifting training you're going to do is going to produce a hypertrophy stimulus, So I definitely think that the nutritional component of it is going to be the make or break when it comes to trying to change body composition, go up or down weight class. And I also don't necessarily think that like just going really slow is optimal. I think you can look at probably a lot of literature to support the idea of these more intense, more quick kind of like bulk cut cycles for increasing and improving body composition as you go up and down weight classes. But yeah, I think by virtue of a lot of different things, for me, gaining weight very, very slowly has been kind of just the way it's happened. As much as it is, I don't know if it's even that intentional. It's just kind of the way it happened, and I'm pretty okay with my body composition at 120. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of different ways to do things, but I think for powerlifters who have been doing it for a long time, like, I don't know, maybe just like SSB sets of 8 with short rests or something is better than leg extension leg curls.
and
Maybe. Again, going to come down to the individual. But.
yeah, and with that as a kind of little bit of a tangent, but when you said there about as a beginner, side raises, bicep curls, love that stuff at the start. Is it a case of more so that it's just not going to be efficient in terms of building muscle as you're a little bit further down the road? Not the case of is this gonna like tire out my bench press, or is like leg extensions gonna tire out my squat? Because I know sometimes there can be that thought process of uh, any contributing factors is going to impact the competition lifts. Is that just kind of more so that they're not efficient for that rather than they're actually going to impact it?
I think the way I look at it is like, I mean, hypertrophy training probably needs to be pretty hard,
Yeah,
probably needs to be pretty challenging. At least, I know there's a lot of mixed thoughts and opinions and studies and stuff on whether or not you should go to failure. That's a big thing right now. But even if you're not going to failure or close, hitting that RPE 8 or 9, like true RPE 8 or 9 with things, then well, you probably need to accumulate a pretty substantial amount of volume to get the muscle growth out of it, right? So I think that if we're looking at doing intense training as powerlifters, and again, this is a limited sort of case study, because you're going to have people who maybe should be doing less specific stuff if they're more experienced because of how easy it is to bounce back and that kind of stuff. But, I think if I have a lifter who's, for all intents and purposes, healthy and able to kind of run the gamut of doing hard powerlifting training, I would rather have them grow on doing squat sets of 6 to 8 than leg press, because we're going to get more specific skill adaptation, because we're going to get some neural benefit out of that's going to affect and impact and enhance their overall strength. So to me, again, in this specific case study, lacking a lot of nuance and context, I would potentially, want to have that person, grow their pecs and delts and triceps from bench press, as opposed to trying to break it down into individual muscle groups where we're not going to get that skills component involved at all. I also think, in that case, the hypertrophy is going to be more specific to the muscles and the strength curve for that person. And, if you're somebody who's, pecs are a weak point in the bench press and you do a bunch of hypertrophy training, but it's bench press, well, in theory, you're going to get that, the necessary hypertrophy in the necessary ways that are going to impact that lift more specifically, right? It's I don't know, kind of theory of sort of specificity of hypertrophy that rolls around in my head sometimes. But yeah, I guess that's kind of how I look at it in terms of the training and where the volume should be.
Yeah. And I think
yeah, again, on the flip side of that, if you have somebody who, maybe isn't able to push super hard with the power lifts, or, doesn't respond well to heavy, high rep stuff, or, is more injury prone, like, well, then maybe we should break it down to its individual components, because then we're going to be able to push harder and get better work in. So it's always a bit of a crapshoot in terms of, trying to come up with a heuristic or rule for something. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely, and I think a common theme through what we've chatted about. I know, obviously, there's a phrase gets thrown around a lot. It depends, but sometimes it's horses for courses. It's finding out what's going to be right for that person, and drawing. I know you mentioned a couple of times, as we've been chatting, drawing on your own experiences, which sometimes is just a thing that you've got to go off, because it might relate to some people, it might not relate to other people. And then it's just finding out what's going to work best for them. Yeah. Quite a lot of topics and a few tangents thrown in there, Bryce, from what we've chatted about. But I know you've given a couple of words of wisdom already, and some practical takeaways. But the last question that I like to ask for everyone listening: what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom from what we've chatted about today?
I guess to sum some things up would be, with injuries and setbacks and plateaus, I think a lot of the times it's finding a way around as opposed to finding a way through. Especially in the context of trying to find a suitable movement pattern for somebody with a bad knee or a bad hip or whatever. Find a way to still use that body part, but find a way to do it that doesn't hurt, as opposed to going in and doing the thing that hurts over and over and over again, hoping that it's going to get better, because it might not. I think taking things slow, being patient, understanding that the process is going to be the process. I got a really good analogy, I think, at one point. I think it was from Isabella von Weissenberg, and she was talking about, maybe it was her or Mike, her and Mike, I don't know. Anyways, trying to give credit to the people who come up with these ideas, but the idea that, like, powerlifting training is essentially like a garden, right? It's not something that you can force. You can provide all the ideal sort of environmental situations and the nutrients and the soil and the water and the sunlight, and that's all the coaching and the programming and the training and the technique and the all these things. But whether or not the plant grows, I mean, you can't directly affect that. So I think in a lot of ways, powerlifting progress is kind of like that, in that, sometimes things are just going to go wrong and you can't control the weather, and, those kinds of things happen, and we have to find ways to accept that. And I think, yeah, that's most of it, I would say. And pay attention to your nutrition.
Yeah.
Last, if you want to be big and jacked and, move big weights around, like, you gotta pay attention to nutrition.
Yeah, I think that was a good sum up of what we chatted about there, and yeah, I like that analogy of the garden and that sort of stuff, because I can only speak for our garden that's literally just outside that window there. I try my hardest, but it doesn't always work.
Well,
Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump back on, Bryce. Really
yeah, for sure.
appreciate you taking the time. For everyone listening who might have any questions about what we've chatted about today, see the content that you put out there, or get in touch and work with yourself, where could people find you or reach out to you, Bryce?
You can get me at calgarybarbell.com. That's where pretty much everything is. We got a growing team of coaches. We've got our training app. We're putting out some more apparel tomorrow, as long as I can hunt down that other box of shorts from DHL and figure out where the hell they put it. But yeah, calgarybarbell.com is pretty much all of our stuff. I'm on Instagram at Bryce_CBB, and we're also on Instagram, YouTube. I think we even have a TikTok account. It's all Calgary Barbell.
Yeah. Nice. And I've got a notification on my phone for the apparel for the clothes tomorrow.
Nice.
So I'll be waiting for that. Thanks again for taking the time to jump on. Like I say, I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.